So today we will talk about organizational behavior, and let us try to first take a look at this overview that we started out by creating the very first time. Now, strategic implementation, that's what we talked about last time, and we kind of went into these overall areas here about setting objectives, figuring out tasks, and communicate. Also, we talked about how to allocate resources. We talked about monitoring and controlling the plan, which was as well a balanced scorecard that we took a closer look at. And we also took a little look into leadership and management because they are also kind of overall ideas about how to implement and how we act. Now, today, I would like to take us through some basic ideas about organizational theory and looking into teams as well. Because looking at implementation is also to understand the organization. And in order to understand the organization, it makes a lot of sense looking into organizational theory and organizational behavior. So this is what we will be doing this time. And then later on, we will take a closer look at these people here, but that's not today, but we could look into perception, attitudes, personality, etc. And we will take a closer look at that another time. So looking into organizational behavior, we have a very nice overview in the book that I would like to elaborate a little bit upon. First, I would like us to focus at the output, because the output is, of course, what is quite interesting together with the unit of analysis. And let's see what we find here. Well, of course, the output is the organization and the behavior of the organization. And therefore, what we are kind of interested in is the study of this behavior from our organization. Now, what units can we take a closer look at? Well, of course, we have the individual and those people working in the organization, making up the organization in the end. And then, of course, when people start working together, we could look at groups and teams, which is what we will also be looking at today. And then we will look at the organization as a system and as a whole. These three areas here, the organization, how it works, how we look at our organization, how we understand ourselves, together with groups and groups behavior and individuals, all of these three things kind of make up organizational behavior. And today we will be looking into these organizational systems and groups, and next time we'll take a closer look at individuals. So, looking into the organizational system, here we find inspiration and research within anthropology, where we have issues like comparative values, comparative attitudes, cross-cultural analysis, organizational culture, and of course, environment and power. So these issues from anthropology, of course, have a great impact on the organization and the way the organization is looking upon itself and the way it is working on a more daily basis, and also how it works with strategy. So anthropology can be quite a good help in understanding an organization. Then sociology, also a very nice tool, and where we find things like formal organization theory, organizational technology, change, and culture. Also, understanding this help us to understand the organization as a system, and therefore help us to understand the behavior of the organization. So going backwards, you might say, understanding the organization's behavior is to understand the system that the organization is working within and is working by, and taking a closer look at, for example, organizational technology, change and culture, and understanding the theory of organizations help to, in the end, again, understand behavior. So that's sociology. Then we have social psychology. And now we are getting closer to, of course, the individual, but right here, social psychology is very much about the groups and the teams that we have in the organization, and how the group and the teams operate and think, and how they communicate, how they solve conflicts, how they behave between each other, also is part of us understanding, in the end, organizational behavior. And the last one, we have ordinary psychology, which has to do, of course, with learning, motivation, personality, emotions, perceptions, etc., and has an input to understanding the individual that has input into us understanding the organizational behavior as such. So we would like to understand organizational behavior. In doing that, we can investigate the organizational system, the groups and teams, and the individuals. And in order to understand the individuals, we take a closer look at psychology. We use those tools from psychology to understand the individuals in the organization. And we use social psychology science to understand groups, teams, and we use sociology as well, and anthropology in order to understand how does this organization work. Now, if we take a closer look at these units of analysis, individual, group, and organization, then we can have this division here, saying that we have the individual level, this unit of analysis. If we take a closer look at what is it that we find here, what is the input? So looking at individuals, we find diverse people, we find diverse personality, we have people with different values. And what happens when people have, and we find different people with diversity, personality, and values that might be different? Well, that leads us to use this understanding of these people to understand the processes that takes place within these guys. What kind of emotions do they have? What motivate them? What kind of perception do they have? How do they perceive reality and the world? And how do they make decisions? So understanding people and understanding what goes on inside the people's heads means that we can start to understand the outcomes. Means, for example, also something about the behavior of these people. What kind of attitudes do they have? Why do they have this attitude? Why are they positive? Why are they negative towards this? Why do they develop stress? How can it be that they are performing these tasks in this particular way, maybe good, bad, or different, etc. So on the individual level, we have the input from the individuals being them. And when we understand that, we can understand what goes on inside these people, and we can start to understand why they are reacting in the way they do. The same goes with groups. Up here, we have the science here, and we have the groups. What's the input? Well, we have structure of groups, we have group roles, responsibility. Understanding this, we can try to understand what takes place inside the group. How do they communicate? What kind of leadership, power, politics? And then we can try to understand why is it that they behave in this way? What is the group cohesion? What is it about group functioning? And the last level would be here on the organizational level. If we have a specific structure, we have a specific culture in an organization. If we understand the structure, if we understand the culture, then it makes it easier for us to understand how is it that the organization as such works, and what is it that they perform. What's the productivity? How is it that they survive? How do they think about survival? So that's about understanding the organization. Where do we find the input to get more knowledge about the individual, group, and organizational level? So the overview going back is here, and today we will look within this frame here. This is where we'll try to have our focus about organizational theory mostly, and about group and team processes. This is what we'll be focusing on. So before we start to take a closer look at this, I would like to line up some differences that we have been seeing within our environment that may have an influence on how is it that we are behaving and how is it that we understand organizations. Now, taking a look at the 60s and comparing it with today, let's try to see at these points here. In the 60s, we had mass production. We, of course, still do have mass production in certain areas of the world, but in our Western world, Denmark, Europe, we have seen that we have gone from very huge mass production to more specialized production. Does that mean anything in the way we would organize our companies? Yes, there's a great difference in operating a production unit that goes for mass production and operating a unit that has specialized production. Another thing is that we have went from single operations to more integrated operations. So instead of people just doing one single task all the day through, we have more integrated operations. Also today, we have a more flat structure in our organizations and not so hierarchical structures as we saw in the 60s. We also saw in the 60s that we had a lot of authority. People really just said yes, no, yes, sir, etc. And today, we have much more influence from employees. And today, we have a very high degree of change in our environment. Whereas in the 60s, the change degree was not really that high. Does that mean anything? Yes, of course. It means something to employees that need to be ready to adapt to changes. And not everybody is that. And a few more. We had low diversity, and today we have a high degree of diversity. And before we had one-way communication, today we have more dialogue. We had instructions, compared to today we have more leadership. We had tight control and more loose control today, and hierarchies, and today more democracy. So try to hang on to these here, because we'll get back to these characteristics from the 60s, because lots of companies still have these characteristics and operate as if we were in the 60s. So taking that into organizational theory, we will take a closer look at 5 different theories about organizations. We have the technical rational approach, we have a human approach, system theory approach, contingent theory, and we have lenses. And we will start out by reflecting a little bit upon the technical rational approach and understanding of organizations. Now, there were at least 2 guys, Max Weber and Frederic Taylor, that had a great impact on this more technical and rational approach. Max Weber was looking very much into what he called bureaucracy, and it wasn't an idea to have a bureaucracy in itself, but it was his observations that said this is what I would call a bureaucracy when we, for example, have hierarchical reporting structures. And he didn't really say that this is bad or good. He just said this is a way to organize a company. But he had this more technical, rational approach in his way of understanding the organization. So one of his points is that bureaucracy consists of hierarchical reporting structures. Also, everybody in an organization have and must have well-defined tasks and responsibilities. It doesn't work in the best way, he thinks, if someone is kind of overlapping or doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So they shouldn't experiment. Everybody should know its right place and who they are reporting to, this hierarchical structures. Then an organization working as a bureaucracy, they would develop their rules and procedures for completing tasks. So they would do analysis of the organization and the task simply to figure out how do we then define the task and responsibilities and who is going to report to who and who is going to be in charge. And a very funny thing here, I would say, is that employee positions based on merit in the organization simply means you are promoted based on how long time you have been in the organization. And if you're not making a lot of mistakes, then basically you are positioned because you have been there. And then he had this idea about employees. They are impartial and unemotional. And that probably hasn't changed since the 60s until now. People are partial, people are emotional, and they also were that in the 60s. So let's try to see if we look at what we have today. Does it fit with what we have today? Specialized production, integrated operations, flat structure, employee influence, etc. Looking at hierarchical reporting structures, does that fit with integrated operations, flat structure, employee influence? Not really. So all of these ideas that Max Weber had about bureaucracy do not really fit with the ideas we have about how to work today. But still, we do have lots of companies working with bureaucracy. And if we look at our own institution, universities, for example, they are quite bureaucratic organizations. And does that fit with the conditions that we would find in lots of our environments and also in the conditions for which the university is working? And the easy question is, or answer is no, not really. But then again, bureaucracy makes it easy to control lots of things and make it more easy to centralize and make sure that the organization is basically doing what we expect it to do. So bureaucracy can be good, can be bad. Then we have Frederic Taylor, and he was into what he said was scientific management. And to him, scientific management is about, well, at least he was very keen on measuring things. And the stories is that he always carried around his little stopwatch and he would kind of measure everything that he came by. So imagining him walking through a production area and he had his stopwatch, he would stop up, and when he saw a process at an assembly line, he would start measuring how long time does this little process take to perform. So that is kind of what drives him to measure time. That has been one of his very key issues. Then, based on his scientific ideas about how to understand an organization, how to organize, he came up with the idea that we should have a very clear distinction between planning, managing, and conducting tasks in the organization. Now, we could say that in a university, for example, we do find a very clear distinction between planning, managing, and doing the task. For example, today, I'm doing the task. I'm simply making sure that we have this lecture and I am giving the lecture. So I'm performing the task. Do I have anything to do with managing? No, I don't. And most of my colleagues, they neither have anything to do with managing. We have specific managers making sure that we are going to do the right tasks down here. And planning, do the managers have anything to do with overall planning? Well, not really, because the planning takes place on a more strategic level. What departments are going to do what, and what kind of resources do they have available? So here we find that planning and managing and the task performance is kind of well divided, and different kinds of people do different things. But try to imagine that we have an IT company developing software. Could we have that planning and managing and performing the task, that it was quite divided? No, probably not. So we could find good examples of companies where this might make sense, but also in today's society where none of this would make sense at all. Then he also came up with the idea that when we hire people, we should select people based on science to perform a specific task. And that means that we should test people, we should make sure that they live up to certain conditions, etc. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense if you have to carry a lot of heavy stuff and you do not hire strong people. And it may make sense in some cases, but also we are still measuring lots of things. And I guess that some of you, if you have probably heard about, maybe even some of you have tried to have a test simply to see if you fit, not necessarily to the task, but today also we look very much into, do you fit into the organization, the culture, and the people you're going to work with. Then he also said that jobs should be standardized and simplified. And here, please remember that he was very obsessed, I would say, by measuring time. So jobs should be standardized and simplified simply to make it more efficient at a constant basis. So the more you could standardize and simplify, the more you would make sure that you could increase productivity. And each worker should perform a minimum of movements. Now, that goes quite hand in hand with jobs standardized and simplified. And if we can standardize and simplify, then we can put a worker down and perform a minimum of movement. So if the worker can take his right hand and move it from A to B without moving his feet, it's faster than having the same worker moving his right hand from A and then move his feet 2 meters to the right and then put down the object. That takes more time than if the worker stands right at his place. So that's kind of the basic idea. Minimize the movements of people working. That would increase productivity. And then, of course, exhaustive measurements in order to find the one best way of organizing is also one of his ideas that comes with the above point here. So how does that fit with today's society? Again, specialized production, flat structure, high degree of diversity, leadership, loose control. Do we find these characteristics of scientific management? Do we find those fit into the way we are and wanting to work today, and also what organizations have found is more obvious to do? Well, we still have some companies and some departments where we find lots of scientific management, and especially in countries in Asia where we have lots of very huge production facilities. Scientific management is a core issue. But in Denmark, we do not find a lot of scientific management. Okay, so that was about technical relations, technical and rational ideas and theories about organizations. Now let's try to take a look at human relations theory. And when we look into human relations theories about organizations, then people within this area, they believe in people, in motivation, autonomy, trust, and openness. And that means that they do not believe in more rational and impersonal entities. They do not believe in lines of command. They do not believe in hierarchical positions, specialization of labors, rules, procedures. That means they basically do not believe in scientific management and bureaucracy. That's more or less what they say. They believe in this up here. And I hope that some of you at least know these movies from the Star Wars movies. And because here we have this guy called Luke Skywalker, a young guy, and he is certainly believing in these areas here about people, motivation, autonomy, trust, and openness. And it's a very good example of how an organization can develop. And if you want to see the movies, I can recommend it, because if you watch it with these glasses of understanding the organization, you will see that this organization, about him, in contrast to his father, that we only get to know later that he is his father, but this Darth Vader figure, he's very mechanistic, and he has lines of command, he has hierarchical positions, he specializes, and people are walking and they're always correct in the way they stand, etc. Lots of rules, lots of procedures. And if you contrast these in these movies, it's really interesting to see how those two organizations develop. And it's just really just according to the theory that Luke Skywalker is developing this organization based on people, motivation, autonomy, trust, and openness, and Darth Vader develops the organization with these rules here. And in the end, Luke kind of win in the first place, and Darth Vader lose, simply due to people not being motivated at the end. So, systems theory. Looking into systems theory is about having different kinds of systems within the organization. So we have these, of course, socio-technical approach. We have the tasks that's being performed, we have a structure, we have people, we have management technology. So these systems here, they of course need to play together in order to have an organization that can really work in a way that can make products, services, etc. So this is a theory focusing on the systems that a company is consisting of. And the next slide here will take it just a little step down and say we could have technical subsystems. We can have social subsystems. So what we would like to do is that we would like to identify the different subsystems that an organization consists of. And then, having identified the subsystems, we can start to take a closer look at these systems to figure out how do they work. And then just take you one slide back here. And we could also simply look at these tasks and the structures and the people and see what kind of people do we have positioned in what kind of subsystems, what's the structure there, what's the technology, what tasks do they perform. And then we can simply use that as a way of analyzing and understanding the organization. And as you can see, it's not the same as if we were using a human relations approach or a technical rational approach. But then again, Should we not use a technical rational approach or human relationship approach when we are looking at our organization with a systems theory approach? Yes, maybe we should, because one does not rule out the other. So right now, we are simply just looking at different ideas about how to understand our organization. So these subsystems, it's also a question of identifying the subsystems in order to make sure we then analyze the right subsystems. Then we have what we call contingency theory. This is where we would like to have these or identify these contingency factors of the organization, in this case, our context. So we have our organization in here, and around the organization out here, we find our contingency factors, but also the internal factors that we have inside the organization. So contingency theory is very much into understanding what is it in our environment that we need to understand and take a closer look at in order to understand our own organization. What kind of social trends and structures do we find? And how does that affect our organization? And how should it understand, or how should we understand and develop our organization based on the social trends and structures that we can see in our environment? So that is the basic thing about contingency theory. And now let's try to take a closer look at what we call lenses. So I guess we all know what is a pig. But when we look at it in this way, then we have this philosopher here. He's kind of asking himself, is a pig a pig? And we might have this veterinarian right here. In this case, she might look at the pig with a different perspective than the philosopher up here. She might think that it has to stay healthy. I can help curing it. So there are lots of different or differences between how these two people look upon the exactly same thing, because they are looking with each their own perspective. And then we might have the farmer as the third one. And he might look at the pig with money in his eyes. And the wolf might simply just look at the pig and thinking, this is a great food. And the artist might look at the pig and say, okay, this is a great way of illustrating. And then the artist starts thinking about what it is a great way to illustrate. So the point here is, if we have a pig in the middle and we ask different people about what is a pig, then depending on who they are, we might get quite different answers, even though that they are looking at the exact same thing. And that is the idea about lenses. And if we take the next slide here, we can see that the pig has been replaced by an organization. And what is an organization? Well, an organization is, well, is it a machine? Well, it probably depends on who's looking at the organization. So this guy here, Gareth Morgan, he has written a book called Images of Organizations. Quite interesting book. And if you want to dig into a very deep understanding of organizational theory, you should read that one. So what he's doing is that he's trying to introduce to us that the way we look at the organization is kind of determining what we see. And that's, of course, in a clear harmony with constructivism and our way of perceiving reality. But the point is, if we can force ourselves in an organizational analysis phase to look at our organization with the lenses of a political system, then it might be much easier for us to understand that this organization here consists of these political systems, because now we are actively looking for political systems. So also a very interesting perspective is the machine, because is the organization a machine? And you may also have heard that an organization is like a machine. It runs really well. So if something runs really well, could that be an organization? Yes, of course, because we have this metaphor that it is a machine. A machine can run really well if we make sure that it's having gas on it, that we make sure that the maintenance is done in the right kind of way. Then this machine can run really well. And then if we start looking at an organization with the lenses of it being a machine, then we will start looking for, is it running well? And where do we need to fine-tune the organization? And then that might actually take us right back to, I'm going up here, the technical and rational issues of understanding organizations. Culture. If we look at an organization as a culture, so it's not a machine, but if we simply decide that we would like to investigate what are the cultures of this organization, we would probably get to know different things compared to the machine metaphor. So using these lenses, the cultural lenses, compared to the machine lenses, will bring us new knowledge about the organization. So should we simply just pick one and make an analysis of the organization? No, we should probably simply get to recognize and understand that we do have different ways of looking at an organization. And therefore, depending on the lenses that we use, we will have different outputs from our analysis, and we will find different things in our organization. And that means when we are trying to understand our organization as such and figuring out what kind of organizational behavior, because that was our initial question, what about organizational behavior? Well, if we understand culture in an organization, then do we understand more about how the organization behaves? Yes, we do, because understanding of culture makes it more easy to understand how they behave. If we understand how the organization is running, do we understand more about how it runs, as of course runs, but also how it behaves? Yes, we do. So these different perspectives here, using these perspectives for analyzing the organization, makes it possible for us to be better at identifying what kind of behavior might we then have in this particular organization. Good. And in this case, this ends this session.